Hello, everybody.
Heidi, hi. Welcome. I
Here we are.
haven't got any babies near me, so I'm not going to have to mute. With that being said, the dishwasher is going and the washing machine is going, so there is background noise because there can't be anything else. As you can see, lovely people, we are joined with the absolutely resplendent Gareth Russell, and he's going to talk to us about something that's very fitting for the month we're in. We're going to be talking about the unknown warrior. Before we do so, shall I disclaim? Friends, it's just gone 8:15. It's Wednesday. It's History After Dark. We called it that for a number of reasons, but principally on our other social medias, we are all veritable paragons of grace and ladylike decorum. Here is the place we let our freak flags fly. We indulge in the four-letter expletives, the filth, the smut, the innuendo, innuendo. If you are in an open plan office with a judgmental boss, put a headphone in. If you're in a kitchen, a car, a crawl space with a small child, don't be in a crawl space with a small child. People will judge. In my head, that child is called Timmy. Timmy is a problem. Get your mugs out, Catherine.
I actually have mine today.
Oh, lovely. Timmy is a problem. Timmy's the sort of child that hears one depraved thing one time, locks it away in his mind palace, takes it to school with him, says it in front of his primary school teacher. In my head is Miss Honey from Matilda. She does not watch History After Dark, so she breaks the first cardinal rule of History After Dark, which is if you don't know what it means, it's not for you, don't Google it. So of course poor Miss Honey Googles it, doesn't she? And then you're called up to school to find out why Miss Honey's in the fetal position in the corner. She's now non-verbal. You need to be verbal when you teach in primary school. She's going to need 12 weeks of therapy, and you've got to explain to them and the social why Timmy knows this depraved thing. Put a headphone in. Alternatively, you can always watch the playback here on the YouTubes. It is always worth watching us live because on one occasion we did utter something that was so unspeakably offensive that we had to yeet that footage directly into the sun for fear we would all go to prison. And frankly, we're too pretty for jail. It hasn't happened for a while, which means one of three things. Either we've gotten better, that's unlikely, or we're due a new one, more possible. Third, and I think possibly the most likely of all, is that we have spent so much time together and we have collectively lowered the tone that for us, the bar of what is acceptable is now in hell. You have been warned. If at any point anybody should come from any of these to any of our comment sections and say something along the lines of, "Oh, I really enjoy History After Dark, but I do wish you wouldn't swear. It's most unladylike." No, stop it. What you want me to do is you want me to pin that comment so that other people come and humiliate you. Look, I am not going to judge you for your kinks. This lot might, but as far as I'm concerned, kink without consent is not okay. If you would like to be ritualistically humiliated in a Brighton basement by a wonderful woman named Trisha, all her clothes are wiped down. She can do unspeakable things with a car battery and a tuning fork. If you want to do that, pay your money and you take your choice. Everyone's consenting. This is History After Dark, friends. Welcome, Gareth. Let's talk about something incredibly important and very, very ceremonial and worthy of all of our respect.
Yes, that was a setup. I was wondering how we get here, but I enjoyed it.
You knew what you get yourself into.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Well, so we kind of got to we're doing History Heroes series this year, and we've got to the end of the alphabet, and it always goes a little bit awry anyway, where we basically make it up because we can't think of anything that goes with U, V, Y, W, X, Y, Z, whatever, however the alphabet goes. But we did come up with a U, which was you.
It is you.
And which links to you and the unknown warrior that features in your brilliant book, The Palace, about 500 years of history at Hampton Court Palace. And we wanted you on, so that was the excuse. And now you're here. So yay.
Yay.
Well, yeah, thank you. And it's a good one. Yeah, the unknown warrior. I suppose, I mean, the tragedy and the point is that we won't ever know whether his name could have lined up with the U or the X, the Y or the Z. The point is in being no one, he's everyone. And that's sort of what the beauty and the tragedy rolled into one.
So I think a lot of us connect the unknown warrior to another spectacular building in the environs of London. What happened with the unknown warrior at Hampton Court? For those who haven't read your book, if you haven't, why not? But let's talk about it.
So they, really, it was after the First World War, and the British Empire was facing the fact that there were still about 850,000 corpses abroad, some of them buried, and some of them, particularly in the Western Front, had been identified at the time. And there was a massive sub-government department, the Department of Grave Registry, that later became the Imperial War Graves Commission, that was tasked with funding and constructing proper memorials and proper cemeteries for these corpses in the key areas of conflict, which in the Western sphere of the First World War had been predominantly France and Belgium, when the German invasion had happened there because a military endeavor called the Schlieffen Plan. Anyway, there's many a corpse there, and those that have been marked or were identified, during the war, are buried with their name, usually the regiment they were serving in, and if they can, some biographical details like the date of birth and the date of death, as you would find in most cemeteries in the West. But there are many, many graves that contain bodies that could not be identified for a variety of reasons. One of the more depressing and horrible reasons was that, particularly after the German deployment of mustard gas into the trenches, there had been, or direct bullet wounds to the face, there had been many corpses that physically could not be identified at the point they were buried during the combat. And even going beyond that, there were so many that died in the advances in the Western Front that trying to identify them all in the panic to retrieve them was not always possible. So there were tens of thousands of graves that are marked and are still marked with the graves that simply said "known unto God." I remember when we were third year at school, which is 14, there were trips to the Somme and to see the Allied war graves, and actually, in fairness, the German war graves were taken to see. I should point out, for the Imperial Army in the First World War, not the Wehrmacht in the Second. And I remember being taken up to the top of the French memorial, which is the Cathedral de Our Lady of La Salette, and going up to the dome and just being shown, kind of as far as the eye can see, the graves of the French war dead. And then we were taken to Thiepval, to the main British memorials as well. And even at 14, you were just overawed and walking through what's left of the trenches, which are all grown over, and getting really screamed at by a teacher. I remember when we sort of stepped off the path, because there were whole areas of the trenches that were still ringed in by barbed wire, where you are not allowed to walk because there's still unexploded mines there, and warheads and pieces of German, French, and British bombs, essentially, but mines. And there are active minefields. And the most recent victim of the First World War, I think, technically was a Belgian farmer in 2003. I may have that date wrong, when he was plowing his field, and the tractor went over an unidentified landmine, blew up and killed him. So the scale of the industrialized horror of the First World War makes this a difficult task, and there are many, many bodies. And the logistical implications of how to get them back are border on the impossible. And there's also serious health issues. They are in the middle of a pandemic. They have the Spanish influenza staring them down the barrel of a metaphorical gun. And also the transport, the exhumation, the safe transporting and the reburial of close to 1 million corpses, the unidentified, hundreds of thousands of bodies, is terrifying. What could go wrong is legion. So they start to come up with a proposal to exhume one of the bodies of the unidentified and bring it back. And this will be interred as sort of, as the Scotsman newspaper puts it, the shadow of the lost host, Britain's dead overseas. All the countless dead whose names we know not, this will be them. And there is it will give people something to do. And this is still, predominantly a conservative practicing Christian country. And there are things that you do that are in terms of your grieving process, that are based on graves. So there's still a tradition certainly amongst Catholics, but also among many Methodists and members of the Church of England, that there's Cemetery Sunday, Cemetery Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, the day that Christ is dead, and you go to your loved ones' graves. That's part of what you do in Victorian and Edwardian Britain. And there's no grave at which to mourn for tens of thousands of families. So they decide that they are going to bring a body home. And initially, there are two people right at the top of British society who need to be on board with this plan who aren't. And one of them is the King, George V, and the other one is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson. And Davidson's concerns, I detail them in the book, and these letters that are bouncing back and forth from the Prime Minister to the King to the Archbishop. And the Archbishop's the last domino to fall. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is why he was so against this, and in particular, really against the memorial that's now at the centre of London, the cenotaph. And he felt, from a Christian perspective, that this was theologically and morally problematic. And he had a massive problem with the phrase "the glorious dead" going on the memorial, because he was very insistent that whilst the church prayed for the war effort and cared for the soldiers, and there were padres in every regiment, Christianity's teaching is you do not become glorious through military service or anything on earth. The glorious dead are the dead of the faith. And he was deeply concerned that Christianity was going to be superseded eventually by a kind of political cult of the nation, and that veneration of the fallen veterans would become part of that. And from a Christian perspective, he wasn't a million miles off in his concerns that veneration of the nation would soon replace Christianity at the pinnacle of spiritual and emotional loyalties. But the crux, the key convert from skeptic to supporter is King George V, who does have quite a stodgy reputation. And I do there's a brilliant book, biography often by Professor Jane Ridley, called Never a Dull Moment. And I have to say, having read it, no, there was never a dull moment in his reign. I still think he was a very dull man, to dissent from the view. I remember when I was researching the life of his daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, who later became the Queen Mother, and she used to complain, she black and blue arms from if she sat next to him and George told a joke, he would find himself so funny. He'd be kind of flailing around and nudging her arm, and aren't I hilarious? And the joke was always as long as it was unexpected, and she was less bruised like a tennis ball, having sat next to him at dinner as he lumbered towards the crescendo of the joke. And so I do think he was quite a dull man, but he was a much more flexible and sensitive politician than I've ever given him credit for. And he was prepared to make difficult decisions, change the dynasty's name because the public wanted it, deny asylum to the Romanovs after the First Revolution because the people were against it being given to a deposed autocrat. He was prepared to do difficult things, and his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, comes to him and says the public support for this unknown warrior proposal is huge. The monarchy is hurting what the people want. And George read some of the letters and I think was convinced, and then with full convert zeal goes barrel into the details of it. And in particular, I think he is won over by Stamfordham showing him these letters, and he goes to the Archbishop and says, this is a Christian thing. We will have representatives of the other key faiths, Catholicism, nonconformism, by which they meant Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians, and you. And I would encourage you to participate in this so that the church is not standing in the way of families who've already gone through the worst thing imaginable. And not every family only lost one son. There were whole families wiped out, from the aristocracy to the working class. This was something that scythed through British society, and the scale of the grief is quite staggering even to read about. And so the Archbishop does come involved, and the King gets really involved in the details of how they're going to. It's not true, by the way, he was involved in how they picked the body. He was involved in how they transported and entombed it. So it's a very long way of getting to an answer to your question. I apologize. But basically, he decides they are going to robe him in the history of his land. and that everything that touches him will be a story of Britain. And his wife, Queen Mary, was a very enthusiastic, and I think probably actually one of the unsung heroes of the British conservation movement. And in particular, she was very passionate about conserving Hampton Court as an arc of British history. And as a result of that, George had Hampton Court in his mind. And Hampton Court is really, by this stage, the last great surviving palace from that era, where so much has happened, not just the Tudors, but the Stuarts and the Hanoverians. And so he says, I want the wood to come from Hampton Court. I want him to be surrounded by British history. So they find one of the oldest oaks that they know has been there from early in the reign of Henry VIII, probably a Wolsey planted tree, actually. So it's something Anne Boleyn has walked under, and Elizabeth I and Charles II and all of them, and they cut it down and they use that wood to make the coffin. And at the same time, he has them go into the armory at the Tower of London and extract one of the swords that have been brought back from the Crusades, and that is to rest on top of the coffin that goes out to get him. Then they start the preparation for what they'll fill they're going to bury him in Westminster Abbey, and the king is very insistent that they bury him where he is today, which is right in the center of the nave, so that never again will there be a coronation in British history where the monarch does not have to step aside from their route and walk round the grave to remember how many people died in service of king and country. So they then start gathering up soil from all of the major battlefields of the First World War, and that will be used to fill in the grave when the time. I mean, the amount of thought that goes into this is deeply moving and extraordinary. And one of the things that I say in the book is, you know, when they're picking this grave, when they're at every stage, the people who are working on this project, it could be someone they loved. The men who cut down the tree, the carpenters who worked in it at Hampton Court, the railway hands who put it onto the train that brought it to Dover, then the navy men who brought it over to Boulogne. Everything is, and then, you know, one of the major men organizing the transport back of the body is a man from Belfast called Major Samuel Fitzsimon. It could have been his brother, Jack Fitzsimon, who was shot and killed 200 yards from him on the second day of the Somme, because they never found his body either. And what they do, which I didn't know any of this, but I mean, I was quite ashamed how little I knew about it, because I always wear my poppy, and I do take remembering that so seriously. I was lucky enough, I think you probably all were as well, to be born just in that generation. I think we're not to get emotional about it, but I think we are the carriers of the torch from the generation who were there to see it and tell us, to the generation who will never meet anyone who's seen it. That's our job. And I take that really, really seriously. And I'm not really a crier ever. And maybe once or twice in the archives, I felt the chin wobble and the eyes fill. And this was one of them, to read about the decision was taken to exhume one of the unknown, known unto God bodies from each of the major areas of the campaign. They picked dates that they were to try to exhume them, to make sure it was after the Navy started seeing service on land. So it was originally the unknown soldier, and then it became warrior, because the Navy had started participating in land campaigns during the First World War. And of course, the Royal Air Force had been created in the First World War as the newest branch of the British Armed Forces. So warrior was picked over the more specific soldier. They exhumed the bodies. The gravediggers were not told what they were doing. There was a different gravedigger team for each site. The bodies were then brought to a British expeditionary force near Dunkirk, actually. They were brought in one end of the chapel. That door was then closed. Only once the men who had transported it were out did a general and his aide come in, and they saw 4 bodies covered each in the British flag, the Union flag. And they didn't know where they come from. And they just picked one. And then that was then taken and put into the coffin for transport back to Britain. And they then had a Catholic priest come in and pray over the 3 remaining bodies that hadn't been picked. They then had a Methodist, I believe, come in to represent the non-conforming denominations. And then they had a Church of England vicar come in and do the prayers, for the funeral prayers. And then all 3 that hadn't been picked were taken. It was, bearing in mind, an overwhelmingly Christian army. I think looking back on it, some people had wished that there had been a rabbi included, because there was a decent chance that one of them could have been a member of the Jewish faith, just given where they had been exhumed from. But Catholicism, nonconformism, and Anglicanism give these funeral services, and then the three are taken to be given a proper funeral of their own again, so they're not just discarded. And the camp allows everyone to pay their respects, and this is the first of the people who kind of file past it. It's then transported for French people to pay their respect, and it's brought to a point at which there's a British naval ship waiting for it called the Verdun, and the former Allied commander and head of the French Armed Forces, Marshal Foch, comes to see it off as a thank you to all the British soldiers who gave their lives for the liberation of France during the First World War. And it's brought back, and it is at the very center of the first ever Remembrance Day service in 1920. And what I found quite interesting is we now have the minute's silence, and the war ended at the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month. But one newspaper account I found said the silence wasn't, the minute the bells tolled, and all you could hear was people trying not to sob. And this vast crowd has arrived. The king, for the first time in his British history, is attending. He removes his hat and bows to the corpse as it passes by, and he makes him and his two eldest sons walk behind it. And George V wrote in his he takes it really seriously. I am the chief mourner for all the families who could not be there. Queen Mary, who is not what I would call a cream puff when it comes to emotion, is really struggling. And she writes later that it's like there was a wave of sobbing that swept through the crowd. And the three queens, the Queen of Norway, who's a British princess by birth, Queen Alexandra, George's mother, and Queen Mary, his wife, are there with three princesses, including his aunt, Princess Beatrice, who had also lost a son, Prince Maurice, in the trenches. And that they're still that's that window that they stand in is still where the female and non-serving members of the non-serving members of the royal family, Princess Anne, is serving. It's still where you would see a lot of the queens and princesses today at our annual service of remembrance. The king unveils the cenotaph. No one is really looking at it. They're all looking at this coffin that the king then escorts for burial at Westminster Abbey. And that beautiful phrase that's chiseled onto the grave, they buried him amongst the kings, because he had done right, and by God in his home. I'm butchering the quote, but it's a really extraordinary thing to see. And yes, I suppose I wrapped it up. I wasn't totally aware that at this point, although they came out actually in reverse order, but I wasn't aware when I wrote the chapter that I would one day be writing a full-length book on the Queen Mother. I might have shot myself a little bit by including her wedding as the ending of it. But now looking back on it, I'm glad I did. So she had the future Queen Mother. She marries into the British royal family a few years later, and she is the start of the tradition that royal brides in this country send their bouquet to the unknown warrior every time they're at every royal wedding. Her sister-in-law had left hers at the cenotaph, but Elizabeth arrives with her father, Lord Strathmore. And during the war, when Elizabeth was a teenager, their home had been converted to a military hospital. And Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother's letters from that period of 14 to 18 about what it's like to be, to see these men and to like these men and see them go back to the trenches once they're better. It's just horrific stuff. But she arrives, and the Queen Mother always used to say that part of the fun of a royal engagement was when something went wrong. And that does happen at her wedding. One of the deacons is dehydrated and a bit too warm, and he faints in the procession. So she and her father wait at the top of the church, like you do when something goes wrong at a wedding. You wait near at the very top. And she saw the grave, and it could have been any of those boys from Glamis who didn't come home. So she let go of her father's arm and ran forward and put her bouquet there. I didn't know before I started the research for the book that the future Queen Mother had. I thought she did after. I didn't realize the first time had been as impulsive as it was, and I sort of wrap it up by saying that's the point. It could have been someone Elizabeth knew. It could have been someone the carpenter knew. It could have been someone the Methodist pastor in the expeditionary force knew. It could have been someone the gravedigger knew. It could have been someone. It could have been Fitzsimmons' brother. I cannot imagine anything in my life more pointless than ever trying to DNA who he is.
Oh, no.
He's all and he's none. And I think that's...
Have you ever requested that? Because you know what people are like.
Catherine, do you know what? In the back of my head, someone has, or there was something, but I don't think it was the British one. I think there was another unknown warrior somewhere where they were trying to figure out who he was. And I can understand the passion that comes with curiosity. That's part of the reason why we're all here, and why, why so many of your viewers are here. Curiosity is the fuel of history. But it has to stop at the shores of humanity. And mystery is also important, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. There is beauty in the possible and the undefined. And I think for me, I mean, I've written about the Titanic, and some of the stories in that were just horrific. And I've, Catherine Howard is, spoiler alert, not a happy ending. But this was the most, I think, emotional I have felt writing anything in any of my books, because it was a really beautiful thing. Because on the one hand, you had you had the individual, but filtering through it was a level of societal grief that you cannot even. Thank God, we are lucky enough that we cannot begin to imagine.
Yeah.
That.
And I think that what you just put forward is how beautifully thought out and how evocative it must have been. And I'm sure if it was even a thought, it would have been an afterthought. But the pragmatist in me, and I did the same tour as you. I was 11.
Oh, did you?
I did the trenches tour with my school. And I just remember the graveyards getting bigger.
Yeah.
And I feel like they did it, we did, as they call it, wipers. We did vimming, and they were just getting bigger and bigger. And we went through trench networks, and we were in like little dugouts and stuff. And and we were on these running boards, and it stinks. And
it does. It still stinks. God only knows what it was like then.
Yeah, it's stayed with me all my life. And all of us we all went in as 11-year-olds giggling. And we came back about 10 years older for a brief spell. I mean, we'd started fighting about again, no doubt, fairly soon we got back to school. But it stayed with me. There are things that I saw, photographs that I saw in the back of pubs that I will never. They are indelibly marked in my brain.
Oh yeah.
But I think there is a pragmatic effect of the unknown warrior that. What people saw coming back, because they organized it badly. They put boys from the same family in the same regiment, and they sent them all over the top. That would never happen again. People from the same town wouldn't be in the same regiment anymore. They started, because whole villages would be wiped out of their men. And it was just us. And then those who did come back, because of the advances in things like plastic surgery, and because of the advances in things like treatments for infection, these were the most injured people that had come back from a war.
Yeah.
And some of them came home to families. They were what they called, I think they called it shell shock in the world, or was it battle?
Yeah, it was shell shock. Yeah,
it was shell shock in World War. So these men came home sometimes to their families, to their wives and children, with parts of themselves not there, physically, but also parts of themselves inside not there. And I genuinely think that if there hadn't been that space that the unknown warrior represents, that the cenotaph represents, that Armistice Day represents, that we still enact today.
Yes. Yeah.
I wonder where that grief would have gone. And how quickly that grief would have turned to rage.
Yeah, and also not necessarily against the government. It could have been against your own community. And actually, one of the things, I'm going to be doing an interview quite soon with an Irish historian called Edward Burke, and he's just written a book called Ghosts of a Family, and it's about the massacre of a family in Belfast in 1921. And he's talking about, like, bear in mind, I have to be really clear with this. I am not saying that the violence in Northern Ireland in the 60s and 70s and 80s was not horrendous. But I learned about that in school. When I was reading about what was happening in the 20s, I was stunned. And you look at things like the Freikorps, the right-wing paramilitary group in Germany, and then at the violence they inflicted, and then the Bolsheviks in Russia, many of whom have been in the Eastern Front. There is something that happens, that this violence of the war created a real rage against other men and against innocent civilians who maybe hadn't gone through what they had gone through. So I think that you're absolutely right. It could have gone into a really, really dark place. If you cannot grieve, you rage. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
And if you're affected and you feel like your sacrifice and the sacrifice of your brothers is not respected, I mean, the, in quotes, great American serial killer boom, how many of those, when they were caught, were Vietnam vets?
Yeah.
You know, if that there needs to be a place for it. And so in some ways, the Unknown Warrior serves twice.
Well, the Vietnam comparison is really interesting because they had to deal with two kinds of trauma, which is what they had gone through and then coming back to a country that was increasingly anti the war, and you shouldn't have been there. And so there's no respite for these men. I mean, whereas that was not the case in Britain in the 1920s. And actually, one of the stories that I put in the Queen Mother book, which is what sort of split focus, but she was great with faces, which actually her daughter Elizabeth II inherited, which I think for that job must be a real boon. But she could spot the faces of the men who'd been at her parents' house recuperating in Glamis. And when she was Duchess of York, she spotted a man in the crowd and she walked right over and said, "You're Ernest Pierce, you were at Glamis." And she could remember
his name as well.
Yeah, she remembered the name because she was 15, 16. So she used to go into the village and get their tobacco and chocolates for them. and playing cards. But she remembered that he loved the countryside and that he had really wanted to open a farm. And he explained that, when he came back, the jobs weren't there in the farms anymore. And so he'd gone into the shipyards, and she kept in touch. She used to send him hampers, and she paid for his kids' school uniforms. But during the Depression, he didn't let her know. The shipyards had obviously started laying off lots of people, but his wife let the future Queen Mother, then the Duchess of York, know. And she brought him to Royal Lodge, their home at Windsor, to become the head gardener so that he could have his own plot of green and look after land like he'd wanted. And his daughters ended up working there, and they were all there until, he was there until his death in the 60s. But one of the things I found out was that once he was at Royal Lodge, he actually finally felt he no longer was jumping, because the sound of the hammering of the rivets in the shipyards brought him back every day to the trenches. But he had to, because he had to feed his family.
Yeah.
And so I think actually, his descendants who had continued working for the Queen Mother, would have said in our head, he was always a countryman. But he wasn't. He was someone who, that's just one story because I've written about the Queen Mum, but actually I'm sure there were millions of Ernest Pierces who never got the chance to go to the countryside and do what they wanted. I'm sure there were millions of them who, having given up so much, are then fucked over by the Depression. It's just, it's very, very hard. And again, the last thing I'll say about the Queen Mother, but it was an interesting, I remember a friend of mine who'd written about her really had problems with how anti-feminist she was. And the Queen Mother really had this attitude of, you had jobs in the war, give them up and go home, go back into the home. And I understand why that is jarring to us, but the Queen Mother's attitude, I keep calling her the Queen Mother just because that's what she's most famous as. I understood why her point was there have to be jobs for the survivors. That has to be the priority. They can't come back from the trenches and be unemployed. And they're just, and that, I sometimes think we're a little too quick, just because it was the 20th century, to put on our own values to what is still, I think, a very different time morally and politically and socially.
And it's just not being there means we can't understand. And I think we have to have respect for what people decided to do in their own time. Back to the DNA point, if you're going to identify the Unknown Warrior, or even think about why that would be a good idea.
What's the
You're
point?
talking about robbing every other family of that grave and the
Yeah.
nation of the focal point.
We don't need to strip.
what?
Yeah, there's a brilliant book. It's not totally linked to this, but I just think it's so interesting. It's called They Flew, and it's by a historian called Carlos Era. It's published by Yale University Press, and he starts off with the miracle of a Catholic saint called Giuseppe of Cupertino, who levitated through a religious ecstasy. And he said, the way I'm going to approach this is Saint Giuseppe actually levitated. And he's like, and the reason I'm going to do that is he's like, I personally don't believe that. That's irrelevant. I will be writing it as if Giuseppe levitated. And his attempt is to put the mystery and the magic back into history, because he's like, that's what people believed. You cannot understand. And he talks a bit about monarchy and a bit about sorcery. And he says this attempt to make it constantly relatable and as if everyone involved knew it was a farce is not true. And the only way you can really understand it is assume they believed it until you're proven otherwise. Don't assume everyone's a skeptic. And I think that's to me, it was such a simple point, but I think it's brilliant. And I do think of that with The Unknown Warrior. So I took all the sentimentality seriously, and I'm not someone who, I don't know, I think we maybe have gotten to the point where we think being detached from sentiment makes us intellectually superior. And I just don't believe that's the case. I really think sentiment and emotion has a very important part to play in how we interact with things that happen in our own society. And like, it can go too far. Of course it can. But I would rather be sentimental about 1920 than a cynic. That from having written about it, I do think most people involved in it were acting in genuine, sincere good faith and in heartbreak.
But it's about an emotion. Sorry, Fipa.
No, go on, you go, Catherine.
I was just saying, it's about sort of that emotional connection. And it can absolutely go too far. There are sort of things that are very unhealthy. But once you have that vested interest, it's not exactly, you could argue about altruism or whether how much you part of it is you're doing for yourself in a sense. But once you have some sort of empathy, you have the high EQ over a situation, you have that emotional interaction with something, that vested interest is what keeps it alive for you. It makes you interested, it makes you apply yourself, it makes you want to know more. And that isn't necessarily just you, it sweeps across everybody, because this affects so many people, and that's what keeps the Unknown Warrior alive. It's what keeps history alive. It's what keeps us all going. And it was when you and Kat were saying about the trip you took, and I was actually thinking, you said, Kat said, you both said, well, it stayed with me, it's etched in my brain. I cannot unsee what I saw. I cannot forget the smell. I cannot detach myself from those emotions. And I sort of feel this, some people might feel that that's a difficult trip to make, and I would understand that, but I think this is when you talked earlier about us carrying that mantle between the generation that can remember and tell us and the generation that will have nothing. That's the way to carry that mantle, and that's something that is maybe the way we should focus a bit more on teaching history.
Completely, and I couldn't agree more. And also the suggestion that I think somehow the suggestion that it should be difficult. It should be a difficult trip. The idea that they hundreds of thousands of people in your own country, millions across the world died, and you should be protected from that because it's momentarily difficult for you. It is just hubristic arrogance, and history comes with a debt of pain. That is part of it, and that is a requirement, I feel, of looking at it. I completely agree.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the ways, it sounds a bit awful, but one of the ways that I've managed to engage my youngest son into history, because he was really struggling before, and now he's doing it for GCSE. And you talk about all the stories that people love. Oh, wasn't it so funny when this person did this? And wasn't that an utterly ridiculous thing to happen?
Yeah.
You make things relatable. But there's been times when he's just sat here, it wasn't this that we were discussing, but we've talked about, small children in Victorian jails and all manner of things. And he's coming in quite a good mood to discuss something with me, and left utterly mortified. But he's got.
But I think the idea that history is just filled with monsters and morons is kind of the way we like to present it. And actually, it was pain and tragedy, and also hope and goodness. I think one of the things that I love about this story is that it synthesizes agony, and it also shows people really doing well and doing their best and trying. And I like that. I sometimes think we have to go, if we can, try to see the good in people in the past as well. Yeah. I think because I do also think there's a great deal of evil and pain that pulses through history because it pulses through humanity. And I hope we're still shocked by it rather than validated. Oh, of course, there it is. I think it's important to remain shocked by horror and by suffering.
Because they were shocked.
Correct.
They were shocked by it.
I remember the story. I can't fully remember who it was. It was an Italian. I think he was either a socialist. Excuse me. He might have been an anarchist actually. But he had been imprisoned in initially one of the fascist detention camps in Mussolini's Italy, and then after the fall of Mussolini and the absorption of a large part of Italy under the control of Nazi Germany, he had been sent, I think, it might have been to Dachau, actually, one of the concentration camps in southern Germany. But he survived. And he was asked to write a book trying to explain, how it happened. And he said the most important thing is that you must never be able to understand how these happened. Yeah. And he really resisted the idea of trying to analyze it. He said, you cannot contextualize these. I want you to remain aghast with horror that they ever existed.
Mm-hmm. And the unknowability of it. We're talking about the unknown warrior, and there is a lot that is unknowable because we no doubt. I mean, I know I have family members who were involved in the First World War. Yeah. Some who came home, some who didn't. I know I had a great uncle who was involved in the liberation of one of the camps in World War II. That is all I know, because they did not talk about this. My great uncle was engaged to be married when he went out to World War II. He came back, and we've seen film footage of the sort of stuff he would have seen, but he broke off his engagement and he never ever married, and he never ever spoke about what he saw. So these things are, and there is this. There's been a lot of work and a lot of studies done on that notion of the way in which trauma can kind of go down family lines and those secrecies, and being our parents, our grandparents being raised by people who had been at the Somme and lived.
Yeah.
And then their children were part of World War II. Maybe they landed. That, whether or not they speak about and they detail the atrocities, that is going to affect the person you are and the parent you are.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because actually I said I wouldn't mention her again, but actually it's I get asked this all the time about the Queen Mother and Diana, and that she didn't like her very much. And I had never put two and two together until someone was talking about another young woman who had grown up in the First World War, and she was revolted by things like eating disorders and about the culture in the 80s of wellness and hugging and talking things out, because to her, these weren't real problems. The idea that you had food to waste, or that you had the option to turn down food, or that you needed a hug because you were grieving, that she could not comprehend that was in any way a problem compared to what she had seen the young men of her generation go through, and many of the young, bereaved fiancés and widows. And it does, I don't think it makes either one of those women or any of those generations right or wrong, but it does make it understandable. If I went through that and, every day you heard someone was dead, and then 60 years later, you're listening to people say, I feel sad. You are not going to be able to process it in the way that younger generation wants you to. You just aren't.
Yeah.
And so I think, and by the way, I'm sure it stood them in good stead when the Second World War came around, and many of them were still alive. And I think it was a generation that knew how to be tough. And there are plus sides to that. There are also many downsides to it. And that's just the legacy. That's all of us, isn't it? I mean, we will all carry good points of how we were brought up and bad, and that's a universal fact.
I mean, I think that the bottom line is that the people who lived through World War I and World War II, whether they were there or they were on the home front, even with the best one in the world, the amount of trauma that exists there, I think even with modern psychiatric care, I don't think there's a psychiatrist on earth that could deal with one individual. And we are talking about tens of thousands and up of individuals. So that repression of it, if they had actually tried to sort out the trauma unguided, unsurvivable.
I really understand the stiff upper lip, and I actually think it was probably a good thing because it enabled them to keep putting one foot in front of the other when the other option was to lie down and die with grief.
Yeah.
What do you do? How do you navigate loss on that scale? Like, oh, by the way, he's dead too. He's dead too. He's dead too. David Calladine wrote a brilliant book in the early 90s called The Decline and Fall of the British Aristocracy. And he said, we've never factored in that a major reason why it tumbles so rapidly in the years between the war is hundreds of estates no longer have an heir. There's no one left to inherit or fight for, so they just give up. And that is not just one class, that happens across society. But it has in every aspect of British socioeconomic and political history, the war lacerates everything around it. And so to me, the Unknown Warrior, the way they did it, why they did it, all completely makes sense.
Yeah.
And what you said earlier about us being the generation to bridge that the gap between the generations, us being the last ones who remember someone who was there, it's not something I thought of before.
No, but it's a strange thing, isn't it?
And because I have always wondered, actually, when you see people out selling the poppies and, how long is it going to continue for? And I hadn't thought about having an active role in actually making sure that it does continue. And I think it's really made me think about that and how important that is, because hopefully God forbid any future generations do find themselves in the situation that people found themselves in the early 20th century. And I think there's a danger in getting too comfortable.
There is there's a really lethal danger, I think.
And we lose that ability to be shocked, like you talked about what happened, and don't see it coming again. God forbid, but So it's really interesting what you said about that, because I hadn't, even with what I do for a living, hadn't really thought about.
I never thought about it.
Part of bridging that gap and really taking it to the future generations.
I mean, and also it's on top of that kind of that perspicacity. We're at such a distance of years of remove, but let's remember that we call it World War One. They called it the Great War, the war to end all wars, because they could not conceive that anybody would be mounting up that fucking merry-go-round again within such a short space of time. And the notion that the Europe and the world nosedives into World War II so rapidly, and that also is one of the reasons I think why so many people are trying to appease.
Beyond doubt. I mean, look, some of them are definitely fascist sympathizers, but some of the appeasers are just fascists. But I actually think the majority of them just thought, we can't do this again. And also, I think there was a sense that actually Austria, the reason they had gone to war in 1914, looked at objectively, Austria actually did have grounds to be pretty pissed off with Serbia. That the assassination, Austria, when it came out after the war, that the Austrian emperor had been right when he suspected that Gavrilo Princip had been backed by members of the Serbian government, like Nedjeljic Kabrinovic, that it had come from within the Serbian cabinet. That, I think, influenced a lot of people, where they thought, oh, actually, Serbia had been involved. Okay, that wasn't the reason why every country got involved, but it was the first domino after Franz Ferdinand's murder. That did impact people, where they started to wonder, are there things that we are just not seeing, that some countries did have legitimate complaints? And it delayed a lot of people in realizing that that was not what Nazi Germany was doing. It wasn't the same. But I do think for a lot of appeasers, things like the Nuremberg laws and the ramping up of anti-Semitism was the moment they started to think, this is a concern. He's not the kind of... I think they told themselves that he wasn't lethally, and he wasn't... that actually a lot of the stuff, the anti-Semitic rhetoric of the Nazi Party had not been serious. And then the Nuremberg laws come through, and they start to think, well, if he's serious about that, he must also be serious about the expansionist of German, the expansionist foreign policy. So I think for different people, there are different points at which they realize that this war is not avoidable because of the actions of the government in Berlin in between, say, 1937 and 1939. But for a long time, the ghosts of 1918 are the reason, are still haunting the 30s.
Yeah, and that's one of the things when we have that oft-recited adage that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
And while that is absolutely true, the flip side of that coin is that if you expect that you can understand the present through history completely,
yes,
then you once again get yourself into lethal danger. And it's again this for me, one of the reasons why I find it gets there very quickly that everybody I disagree with politically is Hitler. One of the reasons why, not only is it reductive, but one of the reasons why I think it's actually lethally dangerous is because if there were somebody who posed a similar threat, calling them Hitler actually, I think, reduces the level of terror. Weird as that might be, because we beat Hitler, and we think it's a foregone conclusion that we will win. And so that is one of the reasons why I'm so against people going, oh, this one's like Hitler, that one's like Hitler, because that means that you presuppose the, in quotes, good guys will win out.
Well, also it means it's the guy who called fascist. You're not going to see it if you keep calling everyone you disagree with.
Yes.
We also recognize it in retrospect.
Yeah.
Yes, I think. I mean,
did he look as like that from the very beginning? I don't know. I wasn't there, but he clearly got enough people onto his side.
Yeah, we had a brilliant module at A level in Northern Ireland that you had if you took A level history, and it was the clash of ideologies in the 20th century. And the first half was capitalism, communism, and fascism, and the second half was after the Second World War was communism and capitalism. And our history teacher, and I think it probably what was one of the most useful lessons I've ever had in my entire life, before we were allowed to start it, he made us do a week of theory. You were taken through like that thick, double print sided, this is what fascist theory actually is. This is what communist theory actually is. This is what corporatism is in fascism. This is what the leader principle is. This is what the dialectic is in communism. And as a result, you are very aware that these things can be hidden in plain sight. And actually, I'm very, very grateful that he made us understand it, and so that we knew what they were doing. And there were different types of fascism. There was Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, German, but there were unifying principles throughout it all, and very, very frightening ones. But it did also make everyone who took that class will still say one of their pet peeves is when people call someone fascist, and it's not actually what it is, because fascism is a multi-headed beast, and it's very good at disguising itself. And it's not just everything we disagree with. There are other forms of discourse that we should be engaging with, I think, historically and politically.
I mean, you've done that module. How many people who talk about fascism have any idea?
But I could be one of them, Philippa, had I not had a teacher who took really seriously that actually once you read, basically his attitude was, if you picked A level, I will not be treating you like children. You are 17 and 18, therefore you will be learning like a university student. And we had, I think it was 18th century Ireland, the clash of the ideologies, and then the fall of liberal Italy and the rise of fascist Italy, and then Russia, I think 1905 to 1941. Anyway, they were tough modules, and like I remember having to do Italian foreign policy in the 1930s, and it was not. He gave us no quarter with the topics that he picked, because there's about 15 choices you can make, and he could have picked a much easier Irish history module, a much easier European. He didn't. He picked the tough ones, and that I think was a wonderful thing.
Well, it served you well.
It did not do me too much harm. And at the time I loathed it, but I'm really glad to have done it, and I'm glad it was. I can remember when he set down the political theory booklets, being like, this has got to be a fucking joke. And I was sort of quite loose, and but it was really, really useful, and I have been grateful to that week and a half of lessons for the rest of my life.
See,
my first degree was in sociology, which I know a lot of people say doesn't count, but
we did do sociology in our first semester at university.
I loved it. So obviously I have that same thing, because we covered all of these different types of things, and I still have somewhere my copy of Michel Foucault's The Philosophy of Power.
Classic, yeah.
And it's heavy shit, but it really is quite. I should read it again. If you see me sort of swooning,
different stages of your life, you should revisit these things. I agree.
I have, and I've passed out. But yeah, it's perhaps something that it's a really good point, that as people, I'm not a historian, but people who work in history or people who are interested in history maybe really should have that as a, when we're teaching. We don't even teach kids this stuff generally, though, actually, do we? Whether we're doing history or philosophy or whatever, this is a gap, I suppose, in education, and you're not going to go into it at that level like with small children, but people haven't even really heard of a lot of these ideologies that, and like you say, they're being, all you see on social media is that everyone is shouting commie, or everyone is shouting someone's fascist.
The rise of Italian fascism is one of the most useful political stories you will ever learn. I think more so than the German, because they're both equally important. The Italian one is, I think, incredibly useful, how it happens and why it happens so early after the war, and how people are just genuinely terrified of the Red Terror coming in from Russia, and people are brutalized by the war, and they're looking for anything to make it make sense. It's really interesting, and a lot of liberals are the ones leading the charge, because they think, oh fuck, we have completely lost control of our own movement, and now it's become dominated by Bolsheviks, and we are all screwed. And that, I think, is why a lot of liberal Italians, the death of liberal Italy is what the module was called. And so it was very interesting. And Victor Emmanuel III, who appoints Mussolini the Duce, was one of the biggest champions of constitutional democracy before the war. And afterwards, it's like getting whatever he wants given to him. It's a good, important story. I think.
Yeah, I think that's interdisciplinarity in studies, which is something that happens in university, but I think needs to start happening further down in the school.
No, of course, I agree.
Because if you want to, whether you're doing English literature, if you want to understand the, in quotes, canon of Chaucer, Shakespeare, etc., you can't do that without knowing the Bible.
Correct. Example. That's correct. Yeah, that is true.
You need to do philosophy. You need to do history. You need to do anthropology and the structural study of myth, like, to understand how these things exist and their place in the world and how we can interpret them. You need to look at these theoretical frameworks, which is not very hard for a 7-year-old. I get that, but there are ways and means that we can make these things.
Totally, I think, of course there are.
I tell you what, they couldn't make these subjects much more boring for children. So anything like this would help, because they're so siloed that kind of idea of like bridging gaps and
freedom and that kind of freedom to percolate.
This is the revision guide of one of the modules Oscar's doing, and this period in history isn't my strong suit, so there are some I can interact with, but I bought the book so I can read it and I can talk to him. And, I know it's GCSE, so I know we're not about to, like, it's not next stop PhD or anything like that. So I know it's got to be basic. I know children have got different learning abilities, but it's there's nothing in here to engage with. And maybe if I didn't do what I did, I wouldn't get it. But I'm like, there is no socio-economic real structure to this. There's very little making people real in this situation. It's this and then this, and then that's probably what led to that. And people were hungry, so they were upset. And it's not till you sit it down and it is, Philippa, like you say, it's just the way. Part of me thinks, well, teachers are given a curriculum and maybe there's a point there, so you have to do it this way and this is what you have to teach, but it's not going in, and kids are going,
it's too siloed.
I can't. Oscar will say, this means nothing to me. So we have to try and make it, give him sort of contemporary situations that he can liken it to, or
that's
even
really interesting.
It down as to ways that they are not allowed to teach at school, by saying to him, you imagine this when you were that age. How does that sound? He said, well, say to me, it sounds fucking awful. And I said, yeah, that's because it was fucking awful. Because, but obviously when you're a history teacher in a GCSE classroom, you can't go, right, we're going to talk about this today. It was fucking awful.
But does this go back to, Gareth, your point earlier about like intellectualism, somehow, not allowing, sentimentality can't come into.
Sometimes I think, it does depend on the the education board, and if the teacher wants to engage with that. Sometimes they don't, and not every has, some of them would say a constitutional history does have to be taught so you can understand the bigger picture. I also think a lot of teachers are just genuinely understandably scared of giving offense, so they do nothing. And they play it as safe as they can because they have mortgages to pay and salaries to collect, and I understand that. So I do think there could be a bit more leeway given to the history teachers, to be honest. But I do think they can. But as with everything in education, it depends on the teacher.
So we're at the hour point. So maybe I was just thinking, maybe to finish off, what could we do? Bearing in mind then that it's our job as a generation to keep this going, what can we actually do to do that?
I think you just tell stories. Go and see the places if you can. That's really important. And I think a kind of secular pilgrimage, or maybe not secular, depending on your views, to Westminster Abbey and to the sites. But I also think just read and talk. It's really that simple. We are a nation. We're a species of stories. And that's how we pass them on. So read, talk, and someone else, God willing, will do the same in the next generation. That's all you can do.
I'd like to get super reductive before we finish, if I may. This series is History's Heroes. So, Gareth, why is the Unknown Warrior? What, if for you, makes the Unknown Warrior a history hero? And that's a hard question, I know.
No, the Unknown Warrior is a history hero because he is every person who turned up over the course of their generation because they had to, because that was the time they lived in. And he is also a hero because he is every family that stayed behind and kept the home fires burning and turned up, both in the battlefield and at the home front. And sometimes the best that any of us can do is to just turn up.
Yeah,
like it.
And perhaps a petition for a revival of Oh, What a Lovely War in the West End.
Yes, I know. Maggie Smith is great in that movie. She's great in everything.
I did that at my school. I was the MC for part of it.
Fabulous.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
As always.
A real pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone.
This is a really rich discussion, and I very much hope that everybody watching either live or on the playback thinks it is as rich. I know you will, thinks it is as rich as we do. And we are running into Armistice Day, the 11th of the 11th. So however you do mark it, I wish that it brings you peace.
Thank you. You too.
So, but where can people find you, Gareth?
They can find me on Instagram, probably is where I'm most active, _ Gareth Russell. And then my Facebook page, Gareth Russell, author historian, and my podcast, Single Malt History.
And your books?
And my books, yes, absolutely. I plug them shamelessly on all 3 of those. Yes, my latest book is The Palace, from the Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of History at Hampton Court, which is available in paperback, hardback, and audio.
And then in 2025, come on.
2025, yeah. I don't have the American date yet, which I'm sure is quite frustrating. We'll have that soon. But my book, Queen James, The Private Life of James I, is out in February in the UK and Ireland. Looking forward to it.
Very excited. Very excited. The cover is chef's kiss delicious. Muzzle, muzzle.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Amazing. Next week.
Next week.
Philippa.
I'm
going to
away.
to Oscar. So it's me and Catherine and a guest, and it's going to be utterly, unspeakably depraved because he is a very naughty boy.
And I'm sad to miss this one, but
I will say, as much as we all love him to death, with Phil, I only believe he's going to be here when he's actually there.
So it's for those who don't know.
If you do watch this, you've brought it on yourself, love. We've had this.
The Phil she's talking about is he is a wonderful historian about priest hides, and so we will be discussing things of that nature.
What he's actually going to be talking about is, some of you might have seen when we did Nicholas Owen as one of our history heroes, and we would have talked about, and Kat knows a lot about Father John Gerard as well. So it's going to be talking a lot about Father John Gerard and actually his trips to Rome and his discussions with the Pope, and how the information that went back and forth via those visits means we have the information that we do about the gunpowder plot.
So very exciting. Please do like this video, share it with your pals. Also subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon, select all in the drop down. YouTube claims that will be a prompt for them to tell you when we are next going live. They lie though, like the devil. So make sure that you are following us on social medias. We are over on the Instagram. If you wish to join our close friends, or indeed if you would like to support us with a Winnebago, then you can do that over at buymeacoffee.com/had podcast. When I'm talking about close friends, that is a place on Instagram where if you join it, Catherine goes out and finds some utterly depraved history-related memes. It's usually involving a beaver because she's got a bit of a thing for that. And then she will put that up on Close Friends for you to enjoy. We also have merch. Catherine's got a rough beaver. We've also got some History After Dark merch. We've got some Timmy's a Problem merch. We've got some No Feet for Free on the internet merch. Anything else?
Can I just have a quick interjection about close friends? Because people have been saying, well, I don't see close friends posts. And I've gone through and I've been putting things out. I think people just think that they see stories on Instagram. I don't know. So I do need to make a post about this. But if this applies to you, if you have paid to be a close friend, which you do via buymeacoffee.com/had podcast, then you should be seeing those posts. And I think there's a couple of people that have been having problems with that. And I've tried to go through and make sure that everybody's in the thing. And so, but let me know if you have paid and you have not been getting any. Like I put one out today. So, which if you're watching this later on is the
6th of November.
6th of November. And so look out for when you've last seen them. But it is a paid thing. And I think people aren't necessarily realizing
if you have paid, you will know that you're a part of our close friends, because when you see our avatar at the top of Instagram, it will have a green circle around it. If you can see that, you're part of our close friends. If you have paid and you never see a green circle around it, then do please reach out. We also have a Substack, historyafterdarkhub.substack.com. That's going to be a place where stuff's going to happen. Check it out. I think that might be all of the things. Once again, enormous thanks,
Gareth.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you, Gareth.
An emotive, rich discussion. As always, just endlessly grateful you give us your time. But for everybody else, thank you so much for either watching us live or if you're watching on the playback. We appreciate you, and we will see you all next time. I'm going to count us out. Be good. If you can't be good, be careful. And if you can't be careful, don't get caught. We're going to leave in 3, 2, 1. Bye.